Hello, it's Mr. Nolan again with your reading of Civil War at 150. Appomattox was not the end. This is dated April 9th, 2015. You might want to note the date. There was a great humorless arrogance about him, for he had never been blessed with a moment of self doubt. He liked to say he was in morals, not in politics. From this, the logical deduction was that people who opposed him, numerous though they undoubtedly were, must be willfully wrong. From This Hallowed Ground, Bruce Caton, 1959. Now, Bruce Caton was a novelist, and this is a novel, The Hallowed Ground, a novel about the Civil War. So, not necessarily a historical fact, but he was talking about a historical person. Um, in the questions that you are receiving, you're going to be asked to try to figure out who that might be. Good luck with that. Could be a few people. So let's read. Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender to Union General Ulysses S. Grant in the little town of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, 150 years ago today, is generally judged to have been the end of the American Civil War. Yet it wasn't nearly that simple. And that assumes that the Civil War really ever ended in the first place. Let's start with the history of 150 years ago, before that of the present day. In retrospect, Grant's Western Army, working with naval forces on the Mississippi River, broke the back of the Confederacy the day after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg when they cleared the Mississippi River the Mississippi River Valley by taking Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863. Yet the Confederates, aided as always by poor generalship on the Union side, fought on stubbornly. Lincoln finally made Grant commander of all Union forces, enabling him to take over the Eastern Theater with a plague of poor military leadership, much of it driven by the phenomenon of politician generals. Lincoln had an uneasy coalition of ideologues and pragmatists to deal with throughout the war. Was always the worst. Now, before I go on, I want to explain ideologues and pragmatists. Ideologues are people who stick to what they believe is right, no matter whether or not it's working. This is what is right, and this is what we're going to continue to do. Pragmatists are people who basically do what seems to be the most sensible, whether or not it works with their ideals. So, this is the easy thing. This is the thing that's going to work the best for us. That would be the pragmatic solution. So, when you have them working together, you're going to have conflict because some people are going to want to just do what they think is right all the time, and some people are going to want to do what they think is going to be the most useful. So there's that. Let's move on. Grant went into the field with the vaunted but usually snake bit Army of the Potomac. That means they had a tendency to get themselves smacked around. And immediately moved to close with Lee's legendary Army of Northern Virginia in 1864. Close with literally means to get closer to them. In a series of brutal, grinding battles, whether he won or not, Grant kept moving forward and a little sideways, always getting closer to the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. At great cost, Grant had pinned Lee, master of maneuver warfare, into a totally defensive posture outside Richmond, then proceeded to slowly cut off his supplies and tighten the noose. With his protege William Tecumseh Sherman having marched, pillaged, and burned his way through Georgia and South Carolina, where Union forces were especially vengeful to the cradle of secession and the site of the war's beginning, and the Navy having cut off all southern seaports, Confederate options were dwindling to only a few. Lee decided to break out of his position just out of Richmond and link up with other big remaining Confederate army in North Carolina. But his attempt to push back the Union forces to gain some needed separation for retreat backfired. The next day, April 3rd, 1865, Lincoln, who was already at a forward base, made a quick trip up the James River by gunboat and walked down the streets to the Confederate capital, stunning onlookers, accompanied by only a small detachment of Navy sailors. There he sat at the desk of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Having reduced Lee's army by attrition, that means he just picked them off one at a time, and gotten it on the run, Grant didn't bother himself with Richmond, and following Lee instead in a close pursuit, raced to cut his forces off. Finally, cavalry ace Phil Sheridan, another Grant protege from the Western Army, whose harrying attacks slowed Lee's army and reduced its strength, managed to get in front of Lee with enough strength to hold him until Grant's army caught up. After a brief engagement, Lee at last acceded to the obvious and sent forth an officer on horseback bearing a white flag. He had already gotten a letter from Grant. There, in the front parlor of a little house in the little village of Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered his army to Grant. Now, this isn't in the reading, but here's something kind of funny. The first battle of the Civil War was the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas, depending on which side you listen to. That was fought on a man's farm, and that guy did not like the idea of the Civil War taking place in his backyard. So he left Manassas and moved to Appomattox Courthouse. The document that ended the war was actually signed in his front living room. So this dude had the war begin and end on his property, which I think is kind of interesting. I can't remember his name, but that's true. You can look it up. Moving on. Lincoln had met with Grant and Sherman a few weeks earlier at the Union Forward Base near Richmond to discuss the war's ending and the peace to follow. They had played a very hard game with the Confederates, but once the war was won, Lincoln wanted a degree of magnanimity to prevail. It means he wanted to be a nice guy. Grant's terms for Lee's surrender, allowing the defeated soldiers to freely return to their homes by horseback, reflected this. All weapons and equipment would be turned over to Union forces, save for the sidearms of the officers, including Lee's own sword, which would not become a famous trophy of the United States Army. No one was to be imprisoned. All were free to move into the future as Americans. But it was not so simple. Nearly 200,000 Confederate troops remained in the field, with the Confederate government still at large. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, a West Pointer who had served as the U.S. Secretary of War and U.S. Senator from Mississippi, tried to rally the forces. He met with General Joe Johnston in North Carolina, commander of the army Lee had been trying to link up with before he was overtaken by the Army of the Potomac, that at last moved with alacrity. Johnson was at best noncommittal. Davis, a fanatical ideologue with regard to maintaining the ancient regime of slaver aristocracy, tried many things to keep it going. Then Lincoln was assassinated by actor John Wilkes Booth and a Confederate cabal. That just means a group of them. That made it hard on Sherman when on April 17th he offered even more magnanimous terms of surrender to Johnston than Grant had given to Lee. News traveled slower in those days. Sherman only learned of Lincoln's death by a coded telegram just before meeting with the Confederate general. Lincoln's assassination didn't change Johnston's mind. He considered it an act of madness. But Sherman went too far for a Union cabinet now vengeful in Lincoln's absence. The notorious scourge of the South was hysterically denounced as a closet pro-Confederate. That means they thought, like, at the end of the day, he sided with the Confederates, which is crazy because he burned Georgia to the ground. More than a month after Lee's surrender, after holding a clandestine meeting of the Confederate cabinet in Georgia, Davis was finally captured trying to make his way west of the Mississippi to establish a new redoubt of resistance to the Union. In the wake of Davis's capture, remaining Confederate forces surrendered. After imprisonment, Davis was finally amnestied in 1868 by Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, who was nearly driven from office by radical Republicans out to publish the South in Reconstruction. Had Lincoln, a master politician, lived, he might have threaded the needle of returning the South to the Union with honor while ensuring that African Americans gained their full measure of rights. In the aftermath of his assassination, neither happened, and hatreds on both sides have festered ever since. The Deep South, cradle of slavery, remained the principal roadblock to civil rights for another century, frequently opposing its black population. Frequently oppressing its black population, mightily resisting the Civil Rights Act proposed by John F. Kennedy and enacted by Lyndon Johnson. Today, most of the old Confederacy stands as a core of reactionary politics in America, and of course is the principal base of opposition to America's first black president, Barack Obama. And the quote at the top of the column regarding Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner in 1856 could apply to any number of hyperpartisan politicians and commentators today.